Donald paused in the dimness of the long corridor, stopping in surprise. Ahead, the slightly ajar door to her private quarters let a thin strip of warm light spill onto the carpet. He thought he heard a faint sound, a soft, muffled sob, barely audible in the nighttime silence. At first, he assumed it was his imagination. This house typically sank into stillness when the clock struck past midnight. But no, the sound repeated, this time a bit clearer. Someone was crying behind the door, trying not to make noise. An uninvited guest, anxiety stirred within him. Donald knew every corner of this luxurious mansion, every creak. Sleepless nights were nothing new to him. Often, insomnia drove him to the library or the billiard room, where he tried to distract himself from heavy thoughts. But tonight, his path had led him past Melania's quarters, and now he stood, his own worries forgotten, listening to someone else's pain. He cautiously approached the doorway, careful not to betray his presence with a creak of the floorboards. His heart ached strangely in his chest. The crying was coming from Melania's room. Donald froze for a moment, unable to believe his ears. Melania never allowed herself to show weakness, especially not in front of him. Her restraint, almost icy grace had become a familiar shield behind which she hid her emotions. Seeing her vulnerable was as unthinkable as seeing tears on a marble statue. And yet, behind that door, it was her crying. His memory helpfully supplied an image. Melania, always impeccably composed, with a straight back and a calm gaze, how she had been earlier that day. They had briefly crossed paths at dinner that evening, she, as usual, quiet, polite, with a faint smile in response to his routine questions about her day. Nothing had hinted at a storm. He, absorbed in his own affairs and thoughts, hadn't lingered long, exchanged a few words and retreated to his study, considering the conversation a fulfilled marital duty. Now, those fleeting moments of the day echoed in his mind as a hollow reproach. How little attention he had paid her, how little he had noticed. Donald felt an unpleasant heaviness settle in his stomach. Why was she crying? What had happened? Had he missed something? In recent months, his life had followed a well-worn track. Business meetings, calls, public appearances, all strictly scheduled to leave no time to dwell on the growing emptiness inside. Melania was always there, a quiet shadow, a part of his world's decor, always elegant and reserved. He had grown accustomed to her not complaining, to assuming she was content, or at least had accepted their way of life. But was her silence truly consent? Another sob, painful and prolonged, grated on his nerves. He could no longer stand idly by. Carefully, almost silently, Donald pushed the door open wider. The warm light from the bedside lamp flooded his figure, pulling him out of the corridor's darkness. The room smelled of Melania's light floral perfume, mingled with the coolness of the night air drifting through the slightly open window. In the far corner, on the floor by the bed, Melania sat, curled up like a wounded bird. Her silk robe clung darkly to her thin shoulders, her chestnut hair hiding her face, and only her trembling shoulders betrayed her state. Nearby on the carpet lay a silver phone and something else, perhaps a photo frame, face down. Seeing her so defenseless, Donald felt his heart constrict. He couldn't recall the last time he had seen his wife cry. It seemed like never. Even in the toughest moments, when the world around them descended into chaos, Melania had remained calm, as if frozen. And now, before him was not the glossy-style icon, not the flawless beauty from magazine covers, but simply a woman, broken by grief, alone in her sorrow. He exhaled softly, trying not to startle her with his presence, but a floorboard creaked traitorously under his foot. Melania flinched and raised her head. In the dim light, her eyes glistened with tears. Seeing her husband's figure in the doorway, she froze, hastily wiping her wet cheeks with the sleeve of her robe. For a moment, silence hung between them, broken only by their breathing and the echo of her recent sobs. Donald took a step forward, feeling a lump rise in his throat. He wasn't skilled at offering comfort, and tenderness came to him with difficulty. Years of adapting to the harsh persona of a businessman had taken their toll. But now, all of that seemed to lose meaning. Before him was his wife, suffering so openly that ignoring it was beyond his strength. He slowly lowered himself to one knee beside her, bringing himself to her level. He wanted to reach out, to touch her shoulder, but hesitated, unsure if it would be welcome. In the past, he had rarely shown such direct affection without a reason, except in public, to demonstrate attentiveness. But now, there was no audience. Just the two of them and the quiet night, bearing witness to her tears. Finally, he gently placed his hand on her back. She flinched slightly at the touch, but didn't pull away. He felt the tension in her muscles under his fingers, then their gradual relaxation as she acknowledged his presence. He didn't need words to understand. She was on the edge, and this breakdown was the result of long-held silence, long-endured loneliness beside him. Melania tried to pull herself together. She struggled to steady her breathing, but a new wave of shuddering sobs rose in her chest. She covered her face with her hands, as if ashamed of her tears in front of him. Donald gently ran his hand along her back, trying to show her she didn't need to hide. His memory flashed with how many times she had suppressed her emotions, maintaining a proud expression even when she was hurt or upset. How many times had he seen a flicker of sadness in her eyes, only for it to vanish quickly, and he had walked past, assuming it was trivial. He hadn't asked, hadn't tried to understand, because, as he thought, it was easier for both of them, not to stir feelings that might cause discomfort. Now he berated himself for that blindness. How could he have been so wrong? Melania's silence now spoke louder than any words. In every tear rolling down her cheek, he saw the unshed tears of loneliness she had held back. In every quiet sob, he heard an unvoiced cry for help that he had stubbornly ignored. A barely audible word of apology slipped from his lips, but he fell silent, afraid of breaking the fragile moment of vulnerability with an awkward sound. He wasn't sure if she heard his apology. Instead, he gently wrapped his arm around her unobtrusively, giving her space to decide whether to accept his comfort. To his relief, Melania didn't pull away. On the contrary, after a moment, he felt her lean into him weakly, resting her head on his shoulder. He froze, barely breathing. For the first time in years, she sought his protection on her own. It was a trust he hadn't seen in a long time, something fragile, like a butterfly's wing. Donald tentatively encircled her shoulders with his arm, shielding her from an invisible cold that had gripped her soul. She was trembling, whether from crying or from the internal struggle she was fighting. He felt that tremor and understood that her world was crumbling, and he was the only one who could help her pick up the pieces. In the silence of the room, only the distant ticking of a clock and their uneven breathing could be heard. Donald looked closely at his wife's face. Her eyes were downcast, her lashes still wet, a tear track glistening on her cheek. Even in her distress, she remained beautiful to him. But it was a different beauty. Touching, vulnerable. A beauty he perhaps hadn't appreciated enough while it was hidden behind her mask of composure. He tried to understand what had been the final straw for her emotional breakdown. His gaze swept the room and caught on the photo frame lying on the carpet nearby. Donald carefully picked it up with his free hand. The photo captured a happy couple, himself and Melania many years ago. He recognized the moment, one of those rare evenings when they were simply husband and wife, not a figure and his shadow. In the picture, they were laughing. Her head rested on his shoulder, her eyes sparkling with the vivid fire of joy. He held her hand, looking at her with a tenderness he had almost forgotten he possessed. Surely, before he arrived, Melania had held this frame in her trembling fingers, staring at the happy faces of those two from the past. The contrast with the present had likely been the push that broke her heart, spilling out all the accumulated pain. Donald felt a lump tighten in his throat. How carefree and in love they had been then. A time of untroubled happiness, when each day began with each other's smiles, when the future seemed bright and simple. So much had changed since then. Years, events, challenges. They had gradually built a wall between them. He himself, consumed by his ambitions, had likely constructed it, brick by brick, without noticing how far apart they had drifted. And she had diligently polished that wall from his side, hiding the cracks so he wouldn't even suspect her suffering. And now, that wall had collapsed, burying her strength beneath the rubble. He quietly placed the photo on the nightstand, so it no longer lay forgotten on the floor. He returned his gaze to Melania. She, too, glanced at the picture, and Donald saw a fresh wave of pain in her eyes. The difference between that happiness and the current emptiness must have caused her particular anguish. He felt he should say something, but the words stuck in his throat. How do you apologize for years, for the distance he had allowed to grow between them? A single sorry wouldn't suffice, and could words even heal such a wound instantly? But silence wasn't an option either. He gathered his courage and broke the silence softly. His voice came out low and hoarse with restrained emotion. He asked how long she had been carrying this inside. Not directly, not demandingly, more with pain in every word, as if blaming himself. Melania didn't answer, but her shoulders trembled again, and that silence became the most bitter response for him. Too long. Not a day, not a month. Years. Years during which she had borne her burden silently, trying not to be a burden to him. Years while every unshed tear went unnoticed, and her daytime smile hid her pain. Her sorrow had become a part of her life, carefully concealed behind a flawless facade, and he hadn't even noticed. Donald continued cautiously, trying to speak gently. He admitted that he seemed to have lost sight of what mattered most, that he had been blind, chasing the wrong things, that he hadn't asked about her feelings, hadn't checked if she was truly happy. Each confession came with difficulty, his heart aching with pain and shame. It wasn't easy for him to say such things. Pride and the habit of maintaining a strong facade stood in the way, but now he cast those barriers aside one by one. Because something far greater than his fragile ego was at stake, their shared future. She seemed to listen. At the very least, she no longer tried to pull away or hide. Donald felt her crying gradually subside, replaced by heavy, uneven breathing. She sat, leaning against him, her eyes closed, tears still slowly rolling from the corners of her eyes. Perhaps she was simply exhausted from sobbing, or perhaps she was listening to his words, which she had likely longed to hear for so long. His gaze drifted to the window. Beyond the dark silhouette of the garden trees, the sky showed the faintest hint of pale gray, a sign of the approaching dawn. The night was coming to an end. What a long night it had been. For him, a few hours of shock. For her, perhaps a small lifetime in which she had finally allowed herself to be real. Donald suddenly realized that, perhaps for the first time in a long while, they would truly greet the dawn together. That thought touched him. He remembered how, years ago, they could talk through the entire night, welcoming the first rays of sunlight with the clink of champagne glasses and laughter. Back then, they shared dreams, made plans. Now, they silently shared one pain between them. But in that silence, there was more closeness than in all their recent dinner conversations, where each spoke as if playing a role. Donald felt something shift irreversibly inside him. It was as if an old block of ice that had frozen his emotions had cracked. He felt both his guilt and his love, the same love that had once driven him to win the heart of this remarkable woman. That love hadn't disappeared. He had simply locked it deep inside, consumed by the hustle of his days. Now it broke free, mingling with sharp pity for her suffering and a resolve to make things right. Melania slowly uncovered her face with her hands. Her eyes were red and tired, but there was a hint of relief in her gaze, the kind a person feels after a torrential downpour. She looked at her husband. In the dim light, he saw her lips tremble, as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. He didn't need words. He raised his hand and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face, stuck to her wet cheek. Her skin was cool, and he impulsively covered her cheek with his palm, trying to warm her, as if he could warm her soul that way. She tilted her head slightly into his hand, a small gesture of trust that made his eyes sting. He suddenly realized that tears were welling up in his own eyes, hot, bitter with shame, and sweet with hope at the same time. He blinked, chasing the moisture away, but didn't remove his hand from her cheek. With his thumb, he carefully wiped a tear from her cheekbone. Melania closed her eyes at the touch, letting out a barely audible sigh. Inside, he was torn between longing and tenderness. He wanted to hug her tightly, to shield her from the world and even from the old version of himself. He wanted to beg for forgiveness, to swear he'd do anything to ensure she never felt lonely again. But he understood. Words mattered less now than what he had already done and would do next. No promises would be convincing enough until he backed them with actions. Still, he quietly spoke a few phrases about how much he valued her, how sorry he was. He spoke softly, almost in a whisper, and felt her tension ease with each word. They sat like that for a long time, side by side on the floor amidst the night silence, which gradually dissolved into the first sounds of morning. A cool dawn breeze drifted through the window. Donald noticed Melania shiver from the cold. He gently helped her to her feet. Her legs were numb, and she stumbled. He steadied her by the elbow. For a moment they stood close, face to face. Donald looked into her eyes. Tired and sad, they reflected the same pain, but the icy detachment that had once been there was gone. Something had changed in her gaze, and it warmed him. Without breaking eye contact, he gently guided her away from the cold floor and sat her on the edge of the bed. He grabbed a throw blanket from a nearby chair and draped it over her shoulders. Melania seemed to come back to herself a little. She sat quietly, her eyes lowered. The tears had dried, leaving only faint, salty trails. The silence now was different, not tense, but soothing. Finally, she spoke softly. Her voice, hoarse from crying, was so quiet that Donald leaned forward to hear. She thanked him. Hesitantly, briefly, but sincerely, she thanked him for finding her that night, for not leaving her alone. She had been afraid to face her pain alone, and his presence had somehow dispelled some of the darkness that had enveloped her soul. He wanted to berate himself again. After all, it was he who had left her alone all those days, months. But now, he only shook his head and squeezed her hand in his. Her slender fingers were cold, and he gently rubbed them with his own, trying to bring back warmth. He said it was he who should thank her, for enduring, for not breaking completely, for letting him be there now. He understood. The trust she was showing him now had not come easily, and he couldn't afford to lose it again. Dawn spread outside the window in a tender pink glow, painting intricate patterns on the walls through the lace curtains. The room gradually filled with soft morning light. In this new light, both their faces looked different, tired but at peace. It was as if, along with the night's shadows, the heavy tension that had long hung between the couple was dissipating. Donald sat beside Melania. He still held her hand and now lifted it to his lips, lightly kissing the back of it, a gesture full of respect and tenderness. Her eyes widened in surprise. When was the last time he had been so tender with her? She probably couldn't recall right away. He saw the corners of her lips tremble, timidly attempting to form a responding smile. That faint attempt at a smile was the best reward he could have hoped for. His heart clenched with love for her. A forgotten but not extinguished love, now reviving with every heartbeat. In the silence of the dawn morning, they sat together. He wished this moment could last longer, this moment of fragile truce, the budding of hope. But he knew a challenging path lay ahead. One night couldn't fix what had built up over years. Yet now they had the most important thing, a mutual desire to walk that path together. Melania closed her eyes wearily and, to his surprise, gently rested her head on his shoulder. Not as she had before, out of necessity in front of cameras, but by her own impulse. He carefully drew her closer. A quiet happiness spread through his chest. His wife was beside him, seeking his closeness on her own. How long had he failed to notice that she needed this? How long had he denied himself simple human warmth, substituting it with the surrogates of success and public attention? He suddenly recalled how, in his youth, his father had taught him that a man must be strong and never show weakness. In the business world, Donald had fully adopted this mindset. He had come to believe that sharing emotions was dangerous, a sign of vulnerability. So he had hidden his own sensitivity, along with his ability to deeply feel others' pain. As the years passed, this armor had isolated him even from those closest to him. He thought he was protecting both himself and them from unnecessary worries, not realizing that in doing so, he was depriving his loved ones of his warmth. Now, holding this fragile woman who had entrusted him with her broken heart, he regretted the cold shell he had worn for so long. In this moment, he was ready to be vulnerable, if only to heal her wounds, if only to bring a smile back to her face. Through the lace curtains, the first bright ray of sunlight slipped in, falling on the carpet at their feet. Morning was taking hold, dispelling the last remnants of the night. Melania stirred, opening her eyes. In their depths, sadness still lingered, but it was quieter now, less sharp. She met Donald's gaze and noticed something new in his expression, or perhaps something old that had been long forgotten. Warmth, care, and also a reflection of her own pain, which he now shared. She hesitantly raised her hand and touched his cheek with her fingertips, as if testing the reality of the moment. He covered her hand with his, pressing his cheek into her palm. Suddenly, somewhere far off in the house, an alarm clock rang, a soft electronic chime, the usual signal of the day's start. Normally, Donald would have jumped up, mindful of his schedule, meetings, and tasks, but not today. Today, he wasn't in a hurry to go anywhere. He gave Melania a gentle smile and quietly said that all his duties could wait, that right now he wanted to be with her. His voice was soft and simple without its usual commanding tone. And those ordinary, simple words meant more to them both than the most passionate vows. Melania nodded, and, for the first time in a long while, smiled relaxedly, timidly, barely noticeably, but from the heart. Donald felt a lightness, a brightness in his soul. Along with the morning sunlight, a new mood settled in the room, as if the walls themselves breathed more freely. He understood that this was the beginning of their new day, not just literally, but symbolically. A day in which they were together again, closer than they had been yesterday. He helped her stand fully. From the emotional strain, she still felt weak. He supported her, guiding her to a large armchair by the window, where he gently sat her down to catch her breath. He knelt before her, still holding her hands. They looked at each other silently, but so meaningfully, as if an entire dialogue was already unfolding in their gazes. Donald suddenly felt a tender wave of gratitude rise in his chest. He was grateful to fate for this painful but purifying moment. If not for this night, he might have lost her completely without even realizing it. He imagined how she could have continued to smile politely during the day, hiding her tears at night, until the last spark of their love had faded. But fate had intervened, giving him a chance to make things right. Melania looked at their joined hands. It was as if she was relearning his touch, realizing she could now lean on him. Donald gently stroked her fingers. He remembered how, long ago, he had given her a ring and promised to be there in sorrow and in joy. Back then, those words had been part of a beautiful ceremony, a nod to tradition. Now he realized the full depth of that promise, and he intended to fulfill it, even if belatedly, but sincerely. Minutes passed. Outside, the morning fully blossomed. Somewhere in the distance, birds awoke, their chirping a faint echo. Melania leaned her head back against the chair, closing her eyes. She was exhausted, but the tense mask she had worn before was gone from her face. Donald sat quietly beside her on the carpet, feeling an extraordinary calm. He thought about how much they still needed to discuss and change in their lives, but there was no rush now. At some point, she felt chilly by the window again, and he suggested she return to bed, to rest, even if just for a little while. She hesitated, but he assured her he'd stay close if she wanted. Melania nodded. He helped her up and, with an arm around her shoulders, slowly walked her to the bed. She lay down, and he carefully tucked her in with a blanket, creating a cozy cocoon of warmth. He started to step away, to give her space. But she suddenly held his hand, looking directly into his eyes. In that gaze was a silent request to stay. Donald's heart trembled. He understood her without words. Without letting go of their hands, he walked around the bed and sat beside her on top of the covers. Melania turned onto her side, facing him. Their hands remained joined, her slender fingers gripping his larger hands tightly, like a drowning person clinging to a lifeline. She looked at him for a long time, intently, as if trying to read the truth of change in his features. Donald gave her a gentle smile. He knew one night wasn't enough to instantly restore everything as it had been. It would take time, patience, and care. But that smile was a promise. Things would be different, better than before. They would manage together. Melania's eyes glistened again for a moment, but this time it wasn't pain, but a spark of emotion. She shifted closer, and Donald took her into his arms on the bed, letting her settle comfortably, almost like a child, pressed against him. He quietly stroked her back, feeling her breathing gradually even out. A little longer, and she would fall asleep from exhaustion and relief. He decided he would hold her as long as needed, even if his arm went numb or the morning turned to day. When her breathing became deep and steady and he knew she was asleep, Donald allowed himself to close his eyes. Sleep crept up on him too, a surprisingly sweet, peaceful sleep free of the worries he was so used to carrying. Before drifting off beside her, he thought about how fragile happiness is and how important it is to cherish those who are close. Today, he had learned that lesson for good. In the silence of the morning, under the chirping of waking birds, the two slept, holding each other. Their hearts, fractured by past grievances, began to heal slowly, beating in unison. A new day awaited them, a day they would meet with hope. And though the sun's rays had already spread across the sky, for the two of them a true dawn was just beginning. The dawn of a new chapter in their love, which they would both now carefully nurture.